We are Life Church Livonia.
All right, Life Church. I think I could let you guys talk for quite a while. Apparently you guys have experienced a lot of traffic. I think the worst traffic for me ever, that I experienced was in Seattle. I served at a church that was about 60 miles from my home. It was a brand new church plant. I was the worship director, and so I had a full-time job in the city of Seattle, and we helped plant a church out in a town about 60 miles away out on the Kitsap Peninsula called Port Orchard. And I would have to go from work to worship band practice. That's 60 miles up and down the corridor there from Seattle down to Tacoma, and it almost made me lose my religion. I'm not going to lie. Sometimes the 60 miles would take me over 2 hours to drive, and I wish that at that moment, I wish that I had the skill of teleportation. I would have given my right thumb for teleportation in that moment. And so I get it. There's barriers in our life to things that we want to get to, and it's super frustrating at times. And we want to talk about that today, even as we continue our series, as we talk about what does it look like to grow in our faith, and this whole series that we've called How to Walk on Water, and it's just about faith. And week one, what we try to do is to define what faith even is. And we said that faith is a growing confidence in the reality of God that is expressed through a commitment to that reality even when life is hard. And so if you weren't here week one, we invite you to go onto our website, and that sermon is on there. It'll help give you the context for this quote about what faith is. But what I want to do right now is just kind of summarize that whole quote for you and focus us in today as we lean further into how we grow in our faith. And what we want to say is that faith equals God confidence. Faith equals God confidence. Confidence in who God is. Confidence in what God can do. It's really a matter of trust. As our God confidence increases, our confidence in something increases, what happens is, conversely, our trust goes up. And week two, Alex did a great job of helping you understand that it's not enough just to have faith, because we all have faith in something. The question is, what do you have faith in? What is your faith directed toward? Because it's not a matter of simply having faith, it's a matter of having faith in the right things. Because there's a lot of things that we could put our trust in, a lot of things we could put our confidence in, but most of those things are not worthy of our everything in the same way that God is. Pointing ourselves and our faith in the right direction matters. But even after you've figured out what faith is and figured out the definition of it, even after you've taken the next step and said, I'm going to direct my faith towards Jesus, there are still barriers to growing in our God confidence that we have to figure out how to overcome. And one of my favorite authors on this, J.P. Moreland, he says that most of the barriers that we experience in our life, most of the traffic jams in our faith that we experience in our life can really fit into one of two categories. We either are experiencing a barrier of the head, which is about intellect and knowledge, or we're experiencing a barrier of the heart, which is about our emotions and our relationships. And so what we want to do today is we want to kind of lean into talking about what do we do when we experience barriers of the head, barriers of the intellect, barriers of knowledge. And I want to start with a story about a friend of mine who does an incredible job of busting through barriers. His name is John Johnny. He is a friend of mine from Kenya. We met a little over 10 years ago when we first went to Africa to talk about what it might look like for our church to come around and beside someone who was already doing great ministry in that country. And we said, we don't want to come in and try to save the world. We want to come in and partner with someone who is saving the world. And John was that guy. And for him, the barriers that he experienced in one of his ministry had to do with a ministry that he had in a little town called Kajabi Town. At the time, he lived in Kajabi and was doing ministry in Kajabi Town, which is really confusing because they're not the same place. And so what he would do is he would care for widows and orphans, and specifically a group of about 10 widows that lived in Kajabi Town. And one of his commitments was to make sure that they had enough to eat. And so there were all sorts of barriers that he had to overcome to engage that ministry and to do it well. And the first barrier that he had to overcome was to find the right balance between feeding them food, giving them food, and training them up with skills that would allow them to provide their own food. It was a delicate balance of saying, I don't want to just create a codependency here where they don't even ever learn how to provide for themselves, but I also don't want them to starve. So striking that right balance was a barrier that was actually a barrier of the head, an intellectual barrier, or knowledge barrier, that he had to increase his knowledge about what the right balance was so he could actually move ahead. Another one of the barriers is that the road from Kajabi to Kajabi town is terrible. It's awful. It's a dirt road that goes from a pretty high altitude that winds its way down the side of the valley to Kajabi town, and it was filled with awful potholes. When it rained, it would wash away parts of the road. A big truck would come through, and it would ruin entire sections, and it would create barriers. There were times when we would drive from Kajabi to Kajabi town, and we would get stuck for hours fixing one spot in the road. Huge barriers. Another barrier that we experienced were bandits, legit bandits that would hide along the side of the road and try to rob you and steal from you from what you were trying to deliver to the widows. That's a legitimate barrier. And so what we had to do is figure out, okay, what do we need to do to bust through those barriers? And the very first step is to identify them. First, to identify that there's this intellectual barrier about how you do ministry. Second, to realize that there's a physical barrier there that has to do with the road, and the way that you conquer that is to take the right supplies with you and leave enough time in your journey to fix what is broken. Make sure you have shovels with you. Make sure you have a little bit of sand or gravel in your car so you can get free when you get stuck. You can address the bandit issue by simply going in the morning. Because guess what? We found out that bandits don't like to wake up early. They'd rather stay up late and rob from people than get up early. So you just go in the morning and you don't have to worry about bandits. It's perfect. But I think beyond identifying the barriers, beyond trying to address the physical and the intellectual barriers that we had for that ministry and that John had for that ministry, I think the most important thing that allowed John specifically to kind of bust through those barriers is that he had something that his eyes were fixed on. A goal, a calling, a mission at the core of who he was that empowered him to break through the barriers, that invigorated him with life and purpose and energy to break through the barriers. And honestly, he was willing to break through those barriers because he was a man on a mission. And for John, he was empowered by James 1:27 that says this. It says, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless as this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. This was his life verse. This is what drove him. This was his mission in life. And so there were no barriers that were too big that would prevent him from living into that, from caring for these women, caring for these children. And I could tell you stories about this all day long. We could camp on this verse all day long, and we will in about a month. We're going to spend a whole day talking about this verse and these ideas of what it means to look after orphans and widows. But my point today, and I think the most important point from this story today is this, is that we overcome barriers in our life when the drive to reach our destination outweighs the doubt created by the barriers themselves. We overcome the barriers in our life when the drive to reach our destination outweighs the doubt created by the barriers themselves. When what we fix our eyes upon makes the journey worth the struggle, we push through the barriers. And that's why it's so important to do what we talked about last week, to define what the direction of your faith is. What are you pointed towards? What are you walking towards? What are you journeying towards? You have to know that, because when we figure that out and it becomes worth it, we can push through the struggle. And there are some things in your life, there's some things in my life that are so important to us that nothing could stop us from reaching that goal. And my hope for you, my prayer for you, is that your faith in Jesus Christ would become one of those things. Will become something that you could fix yourself on. And it brings us to Hebrews chapter 12 that reminds us what our goal should be. And it says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. And then he goes on and he says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. I love this. Many of you, if you grew up in the church, you've heard this verse before, and maybe you memorized it, that we are to fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith. But I love both pioneer and author, and honestly, I think pioneer captures the heart of what this verse is about, especially what comes next, because what is a pioneer? A pioneer is simply someone who goes first. Someone who goes first, someone who steps out on a journey before anyone else, who blazes a trail forward that others can follow. That's what a pioneer does. And in the very next verses of Hebrews chapter 12, what the author does here is he reminds us that Jesus went first. Jesus went first on this road of faith, that he overcame every barrier between himself and the cross because he had his eyes fixed on something. What did he have his eyes fixed on? You, me, us, salvation, peace, hope, joy, life, and life to the full for you and for me. Jesus had his eyes fixed on us as he made the journey to the cross, as he overcame barrier after barrier after barrier on his journey to the cross. And so in that way, Jesus paved the way for us to step into barrier-breaking, doubt-shattering, hope-creating faith. Jesus was the pioneer for us, but we sometimes struggle to follow on that same trail that he blazed for us. We struggle to walk down that same path because without even knowing it, we continue to carry a host of barriers, some of them intellectual, with us everywhere we go. And we have to address those. We have to step in and we have to engage those barriers. And JP tells us why. He says, Christianity is a knowledge tradition, not a mere belief tradition. And in order to grow our God confidence, one of the important tasks before us is to grow in our knowledge of God and his word. But ultimately, for this to be possible, we must learn to handle our intellectual doubts. We long for you to grow in your knowledge, your understanding of God's word and what God calls us to do and who God calls us to be. But when we have these huge barriers of intellectual doubts that we carry with us everywhere we go, even as we read God's word, we will doubt God's word. Even as we read God's word and it filters into our head, there will be a barrier between it filtering into our head and sifting down into our heart. As long as we carry these intellectual doubts, these intellectual barriers with us, we have to learn to address them. And the issue is that many of them are deeply rooted, not only in our life, but in the culture that we live in. And we hear messages constantly that what they do is it creates kind of an ongoing background noise, like a static in our brain that prevents us from focusing on what we need to focus on. We hear things regularly like, you don't really believe that, do you? Like, you don't mean to tell me that you believe that this is true. We hear people say, well, okay, so you believe that. Well, what about this verse? Well, what about these people? How are you gonna wrestle with that? And it creates a static and a struggle in our brain. And there's this ongoing message in our culture that says that in order to be an enlightened person, you have to be an individual who is tolerant, non-judgmental, and therefore compassionate. And what the culture says is that no one who is enlightened puts their beliefs on other people, forces their views on other people. And then it paints Christians or people that have faith as individuals who are defensive, unenlightened, dogmatic, ugly polar opposites of what it means to be enlightened. Static in the background of our brain, creating intellectual barriers for us that can leave us in a place where we either are resistant to becoming a believer in the first place, or we struggle to thrive in our faith. It either causes us to be resistant to faith in the first place, or it causes us to struggle to thrive in our faith as a person who longs to follow Jesus. And there's so many reasons why a person might be resistant, but a couple of reasons are this, is that they don't trust that they should give their life to something that they believe is untrustworthy. They step back and they look at Christianity from a distance and they think, that can't be true. That must be a myth. How could the Bible possibly be a document that is trustworthy? I don't believe it. I don't trust it. And they sit from a distance and they doubt whether it's true. And so what happens is that our culture leads us to believe that faith in God is irrational. Part of the background noise that prevents people from coming to faith in the first place is that our culture leads us to believe that faith in God is irrational. And some of that comes from a misunderstanding of what faith even is in the first place. People believe that faith has to be blind, and therefore faith must be irrational. But here's what I know to be true, that some of the most brilliant people that I have ever met, and I have met some incredibly smart people, far smarter than myself. I lived for a season when I was doing an internship back when I first started ministry with a family, and the husband and wife were both PhD chemists who led chemistry departments at colleges. They were brilliant. My intellect was far diminished compared to theirs. And yet they loved Jesus. They had dug in and with all of their intellect and come out on the other side in a place of faith. For them, their faith was anything but irrational. It was grounded in deep, beautiful truth because they legitimately sought out answers. And because they sought answers, they found them. And other people, what happens is they're resistant because they've been taught things, maybe from Christians, about how faith must be blind, that has miscommunicated the heart of the text. And they go to verses like Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 that says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. And the retort coming back from a person who is resistant to belief is, I only believe in things that I can experience with the five senses. I only believe in things that I can see and taste and touch and smell and hear. If I can't experience it, I don't believe in it. If it can't be proven through the scientific methods, I don't believe in it. But the reality of it is that people who say that are actually lying to themselves. Because there is a whole host of topics and things that we believe in strongly that none of us have ever experienced with any of our five senses. There are things that we believe in because we've believed the testimony of others who experience those things. There are facts from our history, our situations about the reality of nature that none of us have ever actually seen or tasted or heard or experienced in any other way. But we believe they're true because someone else experienced them and told us they were true. So we get stuck in this place where we're resistant to faith because we can't say, I can't see that. But there's so many other things that we're willing to trust and have confidence in that we've never seen. So what is the barrier here in our faith? And it gets fleshed out even more when we go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. And this verse gets quoted all the time, and people who are struggling in their faith, and they're struggling to step into faith, and people say, well, we live by faith, not by sight. We live by faith, not by sight. And the way that a non-believer hears that verse often is that you're calling them to believe in something that's irrational, that's blind. But as we dig into this verse, we realize, what is Paul saying here? He's saying that faith is trusting in the promises of God for the future, not in spite of what one knows, but because of what one knows. What Paul's saying is we're not calling you to believe in something that has no basis in truth. We're not calling you to believe in something that has no basis in historical fact. We're calling to you to live in faith because of what happened, what we've experienced, what God has done. And when Paul talks about living by faith, not by sight, he's simply saying that there's promises that God has made that we haven't seen yet. There's promises that God has made that we won't see for a while. But we trust that they will be true because of his faithfulness in the past. It's grounded in something we can know. Something that someone experienced. Something that someone saw. Over and over again in the Gospels and in the epistles, all throughout the New Testament, all throughout these accounts of Jesus and the accounts of the early church as it grew, we see the authors say over and over again, you can trust what I say because I was there. I experienced it with all of my senses. I saw Jesus. I touched Jesus. I heard his words. I ate bread with him. It's real. It's true. And it's powerful. Faith is not irrational, and it's not blind. And yet it causes people to be resistant to stepping into faith in the first place. And still others, they've stepped into faith, but they struggle to thrive in their faith. And part of that is because they fear that faith in God might lead to embarrassment. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. One of people's greatest fears is to be seen as an idiot, to make a fool of oneself, right? It's why most people would tell you that one of their greatest fears is doing what I'm doing right now. Public speaking. Most people say that they are more scared of getting up on a stage and speaking publicly than they are of going to the dentist for a root canal without any Novocaine. It's true. Why? They're terrified that they'll be embarrassed. They'll look like an idiot, that they won't have the answers somehow. Afraid that we don't know enough to engage. Afraid that somehow, even if I dug in and I looked for the answer, that I might be ashamed of what answers I find. Struggling with what might happen if we stepped out in faith and we prayed boldly for things, and prayed boldly for things verbally. You know how many people are terrified to pray out loud because they're afraid they won't sound like they know enough about their faith? They're afraid that if they pray something or it doesn't happen, that it'll somehow create an intellectual, emotional barrier for someone else in their life. And so because we're embarrassed, we fail to thrive. And we fail to thrive because in this situation, what happens is we tend to retreat into a space where we convince ourselves that our faith needs to be a private, personal affair. We convince ourselves that it becomes this thing about, I'm going to do me, you do you. Let's just not talk about it. Let's not talk about what I believe in. I'm not going to judge you, you don't judge me. And what we're saying, in part, during that moment is that I don't want you to inspect what I believe because I'm terrified that I won't be able to give you a good answer. Or I'm terrified that I'll somehow offend you. Or I'm terrified that in some ways my God will disappoint me and it'll crush my faith. But I want to read you a quote that I think really kind of hammers into why we do this and what the dangers of it are. I'm not going to put it on the screen, so just listen in. Listen to these words. Why do we do this? Because if faith is just a private, arbitrary choice, a step in the dark, then who can criticize that? A person can say anything he or she wants, and if challenged, they can retreat into safety by simply pointing out that all people have their private beliefs, and those beliefs are their own personal beliefs. And when we do that, it makes us comfortable, and it makes us feel safe when we retreat back in and we say, you do you, I'll do me. But the price we pay for such comfort is pretty high. For one thing, the difference between Christianity and atheism or Buddhism is reduced in that kind of conversation to the superficial differences of personal preferences. It's like the choice between those who prefer Windows PC and those who prefer Mac. And everyone knows that Macs are better, right? Everyone knows this. Some people don't agree with me. I see DeForge over there. It reduces our conversation to mere personal preferences and diminishes the reality and the beauty of what our faith really is. And it goes on, it says, for another thing, a retreat to private feelings keeps a person from honestly facing doubts and working through them. With the result that after years of this approach, they can no longer distinguish what they really believe from what they say they believe in front of others. And in this case, a person will be plagued with ongoing doubts and lack genuine confidence in God or commitment to any specific issue of the Christian life. And when this happens, people end up suppressing their doubts and becoming masters at self-deception. When we retreat into personal, private faith, it never forces us to face our doubts. It never forces us to face our questions. It never forces us to dig into the answers because guess what? We can just pretend. And we fail to thrive in our faith. We struggle to thrive and to grow into the people that God calls us to do and be and invites us to be. And this is a matter of shaming you. It's a matter of saying, let's step out of that space. Why? Because there's something on the other side of that space that is beautiful, that is life-giving, that is freeing, that is hope-giving. It's an incredible journey that is worth the journey. But we retreat because we are afraid of what might happen if we advance. We withdraw because we have bought into the lies of our culture. And it makes me so sad. And it forces us to ask the question, how do we move? How do we move beyond barriers of the head into vibrant, intellectually rich faith? And there's a host of ways you could do this, but I want to give you 4 today. 4 that I think are important. And the first one has to do with how we address people that are the ones who are sowing seeds of doubt in our brain. Because if you're struggling with doubt, chances are there's someone in your life who's planting seeds of doubt in your brain, who's challenging you to look at what you believe or telling you that what you believe seems silly to them. And so the very first step in moving beyond the barriers of the head is this. Don't assume that people who are the source of your doubt have considered their position fairly. Don't assume that people who are the source of your doubt have considered their position fairly. They say that they're trying to be intellectually rich. They're saying that they're trying to be intellectually profound. But most of the time, I found that when people are really pushy in telling you that your faith is dumb, honestly, that if your faith is irrational and are giving you all the reasons why they believe that they are right, they haven't actually been intellectually honest enough to consider the other side fairly. And one of my favorite questions that you could ask an individual like this is to come back to them and say, man, it seems like you've really done a good job of reading up on why you think you're right. Tell me what were your 5 favorite books that you read that stated the position from the other side, and what questions did they pose that you had to wrestle with? Silence. Because most of the time they haven't done it. Most of the time, they've just studied up on what they believe to be true. They've read things that reinforce their position, and they expect you to be as big of an expert on that topic as they are, when really they're not an expert. They're just a situational expert. Challenge people to research the other side. Don't assume that people who are the source of your doubts have considered their position as fairly as you think they have, and also don't assume that they don't have doubts. I read some amazing quotes this week from atheists who in their private memoirs confessed that they were worried that they might be wrong. One in particular had a quote about how he was terrified that his Christian friends might be right. And he doubted all the time that he had taken the correct position. Don't assume that the people who are the source of your doubts have considered their position fairly or that they're as confident in those positions as they seem to be. Step 2, go after the answer instead of running from the answer. Go after the answer instead of running from the answer. I would encourage you, if you have doubts that are intellectual doubts, write them down. Write them down over and over again in a way until you get to the root of what that is. Write it out and then tweak it, change it. Put it into the easiest shape to understand what it is. What is it that I'm actually doubting? And then pursue answers from reputable sources. Reputable sources. It means you go to people that have more wisdom, more knowledge in that area than you do. And honestly, the internet is not always a reputable source, okay? There are websites that actually have good information, but you got to be really skeptical of that. And you got to check your sources as you dig for the answers. Lean into relationships with people that know more than you, that have walked that journey before you. It's so helpful. And in that process, remember that over and over again, people like me and people like friends of mine that I've had all throughout the course of my life, that when we've dug into our questions, when we've honestly sought answers to our doubts, we have found intellectually satisfying answers. They exist. And it leads us to our next step, is that we have to learn to doubt our doubts. Sometimes what we do with our doubts is we feed fuel to that fire, because all we do all day and every night when we lay down in bed is we think about all the reasons that our doubts are valid. We reinforce our doubts. And what I want to encourage you to do is have a more balanced inner monologue. A more balanced inner monologue where you spend as much, if not more time, thinking about why your doubts might be false. Why what we're talking about with regards to faith in God might be true. Dwell on those things. Think on those things. And it will rebalance your brain into the space where you begin to doubt your doubts and you step out into a place where you're growing in your God confidence. And along that same lines, not only do you need to give yourself permission to doubt your doubts, but you need to give someone else in your life permission to doubt your doubts. Give someone else in your life permission to draw you out of that space where you've just made your faith personal, where you've made your faith private, where you're unwilling to talk about it. Yes, you'll have moments when you don't have answers, and that's okay. We don't have all the answers. We have opportunities to lean in and to find some of those answers. And the final step that I want to encourage you to do today, if you're struggling with intellectual barriers, you have to be willing to step into a place where you're making sure that your doubt is actually intellectual. Sometimes we convince ourselves that our doubt, that our barrier in our brain, the roadblock, the traffic jam between us and Jesus is an intellectual barrier, that we need more knowledge, when really it's not intellectual at all. It has nothing to do with a barrier of the head. And if you're wondering whether your doubt is intellectual, here's a really easy way to test it. Look back at the times in your life around that specific doubt where you've actually received answers to those questions. Received answers to those questions. And even though you received those answers, and even though all the people around you that maybe even are more knowledgeable than you received and accepted those answers, they still weren't sufficient for you. Think back to a moment in your doubt when someone gave you a really great answer and you were like, yeah, but, just doesn't feel like enough. Doesn't feel like enough for you to overcome that hurdle. If those answers that are really intellectually valid don't satisfy you, then chances are your barrier isn't intellectual at all. Your barrier is emotional. It's not a barrier of the head. It's a barrier of the heart. And here's the deal. Barriers of the head, they require more knowledge. Barriers of the heart, they require healing. They're emotional. They're relational. They're situational with regards to people in your life that you know and you love. We're going to spend all of next week talking about how to overcome those barriers of the heart that require healing. It's critical. And in the midst of all of that, as we lean into our intellectual barriers, we have to remember that Jesus paved the way for us to step into barrier-breaking, doubt-shattering, hope-creating faith. Jesus paved the way, and we were what he fixed his eyes on as he made his journey to the cross. And he is what we fix our eyes on as we live into our journey, as we grow in our God confidence, as we grow in our trust, as we grow in our faith. And my prayer for you is that you would come out on the other side of trust, a faith-filled, hope-filled individual who has come to a space where you trust that Jesus really is who we say he is. That Jesus is God, and that we can have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ that leads to life that you could never imagine prior to stepping into it. My hope for you is the same hope that Paul had for the Romans when he wrote Romans chapter 15, verse 13. He said this, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, as your confidence in him grows, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. This is what's possible for you when you step into relationship, when you stop resisting. This is what's possible for you when you step out of a faith that is only private and into a faith that addresses the question. This is what's possible for you, for me, when we say yes to Jesus and we follow in his footsteps. He's paved the way. And the question is, will you follow? Would you pray with me? Jesus, we sit here today, some of us still wrestling, still struggling, still looking at our doubt squarely in the face and wondering, how can I ever overcome this? It seems too big. The barrier seems too large. I don't even know where to look or who to ask. And God, I just pray that if there are people here right now stuck in that spot, that you would meet them in that spot. You would help them to see right now in the space that they're in that you invite the questions. You invite the pursuit of the answers. Because you are a God that has nothing to hide. You're a God that invites us into relationship, that sent Jesus so that we might have a relationship with you, that invites us into a journey in which we begin to grow in our trust and our confidence of you. And so if you are here today and you're in that spot and you're stuck, maybe resistant to God or struggling in your faith with God, my invitation to you right now is to pray and to simply say to Jesus, I choose today to take the first step. One step closer to you, God, today. Jesus, forgive me for the ways I've tried to do it on my own. Forgive me for the ways that I have been afraid to step out. Forgive me for the ways that I believe the lies, that faith is irrational, that faith can only be blind, and help me to learn to trust in the things that you've done, to trust in who you are. I choose you today, Jesus. I choose to begin the journey of addressing my intellectual barriers with you. And I commit to doing that in your name. Amen.